It's strange how the French Revolution is always remembered as the moment when ordinary people rose up, toppled a corrupt monarchy, and demanded liberty, equality, and fraternity. Schoolbooks love this story because it feels clean, heroic, and democratic. But the deeper you look, the more complicated it becomes. How did a movement supposedly driven by starving peasants and angry city workers transform so quickly into a political machine run by lawyers, intellectuals, and ambitious elites? How did a revolution that began with calls for freedom end with mass executions, censorship, and authoritarian control? And most importantly, was this truly a people's uprising, or a carefully guided transformation shaped by elites who saw an opportunity to reshape France in their own vision? To understand this, we must go back to France in the late 1780s, a country that looked stable from the outside but was crumbling from within. Years of war, debt, crop failures, and a rigid class system created enormous pressure. The monarchy looked powerful, but in reality, Louis XVI was running a country that had been rotting for decades. Bread prices doubled, harvests failed, and rural families who already lived on the edge suddenly found themselves unable to survive. In cities like Paris, anger boiled beneath the surface. Workers struggled to feed their families while nobles danced at Versailles. Intellectuals wrote fiery essays about rights and freedoms, while pamphlets spread ideas that challenged centuries of tradition. But even here, the first cracks suggest something deeper. It wasn't the starving peasants who pushed the king to call the Estates General in 1789. It was the elites, the nobility, and the wealthy bourgeoisie who pressured the monarchy because they wanted tax reform, political influence, and protection for their wealth. They needed the king to fix the economy without threatening their interests. Ironically, the meeting that would unleash the revolution was demanded not by the poor, but by those who feared losing privilege. Once the Estates General assembled, the structure of the old system became impossible to ignore. The First Estate, clergy, and Second Estate, nobility, had disproportionate voting power compared to the Third Estate, which represented 95% of the population yet had the same number of votes as each elite group. This imbalance created the perfect environment for the bourgeois leaders of the Third Estate, lawyers, merchants, bureaucrats, to step forward as champions of the people. They claimed to speak for all of France, but their interests were often far closer to the elites than to peasants or urban workers. When the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, it was celebrated as the moment the people seized control. But again, it wasn't peasants storming government buildings, it was lawyers in powdered wigs arguing about representation. Philip Mazzei, an Italian observer in Paris, wrote at the time, "The revolution begins with speeches, not swords." And many of those speeches came from individuals who wanted more power for themselves, not necessarily more rights for the masses. Still, public anger was real, and politicians knew how to use it. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789 is often described as a spontaneous rebellion. But hints of coordination appear everywhere. Rumors spread that soldiers were marching toward Paris. Arms circulated. Leaders encouraged crowds to gather. And although the image of the Bastille as a torture-filled prison was exaggerated, it served as a symbolic target that revolutionary leaders used to ignite public emotion. Afterward, politicians at the National Assembly immediately seized this moment to pressure the monarchy further, presenting themselves as voices of a victorious people. Across France, the countryside erupted in what became known as the Great Fear. Peasants, terrified of rumors that nobles planned to crush the revolution, burned manor houses and destroyed records of feudal dues. But interestingly, many of these uprisings occurred after revolutionary newspapers circulated dramatic stories that were often unverified. Again, public anger was genuine, but it was guided, amplified, and at times shaped by those with access to printing presses, networks, and political influence. As the monarchy collapsed, the revolution became more radical. But the power remained in the hands of a new elite, the bourgeois politicians of the National Assembly. They abolished feudalism, declared equal rights, and drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, documents celebrated as victories for the people. Yet many of these same leaders restricted voting rights to property owners, locking out the poorest citizens from political power. The idea of universal equality was inspiring, but in practice, the revolution was becoming a transfer of authority from one elite class to another. By 1791, the monarchy was on life support. Louis XVI's attempted escape to Varennes destroyed what little trust remained. Crowds demanded a republic, and political clubs grew more influential, especially the Jacobins, many of whom came from educated, privileged backgrounds. It's important to understand that these clubs did not represent peasants or workers. They represented urban intellectuals with strong ideological visions. But their ability to mobilize the masses through speeches, pamphlets, and street demonstrations gave them a powerful weapon. When France declared war in 1792, things spiraled faster. Economic chaos, suspicion of royalists, and fear of foreign invasion created panic. The September massacres, in which mobs killed hundreds of prisoners, are often portrayed as spontaneous violence driven by rage and fear. But evidence shows that radical leaders encouraged the violence, or at least allowed it to continue because it eliminated potential political enemies. Revolutionary newspapers exaggerated threats, inflamed emotions, and shaped public opinion, a pattern that would repeat throughout the revolution. By 1793, the revolution's most dramatic shift occurred: the rise of the Committee of Public Safety and the Reign of Terror. This period is often seen as the moment when the revolution was hijacked by elites who used the language of the people while consolidating personal power. Maximilien Robespierre, one of the most famous revolutionary leaders, came from a modest but educated background, not a starving worker or farmer. His speeches were filled with talk of virtue, equality, and the will of the people. Yet under his leadership, the government expanded surveillance, punished dissent, and executed thousands. The terror was justified in the name of protecting the revolution, but many historians argue it was also a method of removing political rivals. Revolutionary tribunals targeted priests, nobles, moderates, and even other radicals. The guillotine became the symbol of a movement that claimed to represent liberty but relied on fear to maintain control. During this period, elites who understood rhetoric, organization, and political maneuvering dominated the government, even as they spoke endlessly of defending the poor. But even as the revolution spiraled into violence, it remained supported by vast numbers of ordinary people who believed they were fighting for their rights, their dignity, and a future free from oppression. They participated in protests, joined militias, and embraced the revolutionary calendar and new symbols. Their support was real, passionate, and sometimes desperate. And yet, at every stage, that passion was interpreted and redirected by politicians who understood how to harness it. Near the end of this first half of our narrative, a striking pattern becomes clear. Whenever the people took action, whether storming the Bastille, marching to Versailles, or demanding bread, their anger arrived raw and intense. But the outcomes were shaped not by those in the streets, but by those sitting in political clubs and assemblies. Lawyers drafted new laws, intellectuals framed new ideologies. Committees made the real decisions. And although they claimed to speak for the masses, they often pursued their own agendas, rivalries, and visions of power. The French Revolution is therefore a story with two layers: one of genuine popular uprising, fueled by hunger and hope, and another of elites using that emotion to reshape France. The deeper question is not whether the people rose up, they did, but whether their uprising ever truly belonged to them. As the Reign of Terror escalated, the revolution reached a strange contradiction. The leaders who preached liberty were creating one of the most controlling governments Europe had ever seen. Committees monitored speech, newspapers were censored, and even the slightest criticism could be interpreted as counter-revolutionary. Ordinary workers, who had once believed they were fighting for bread and justice, now found themselves living in fear of being accused of lacking revolutionary loyalty. Yet the leaders continued to insist that everything was being done for the people, even as the people lost more and more control over their own lives. There is an uncomfortable truth buried in these events. Revolutions rarely collapse because of external enemies. They collapse because internal power struggles devour the movement from within, and the French Revolution was no exception. Rival factions within the revolutionary government, the Girondins, the Jacobins, the Hébertists, the Dantonists, spent more time fighting each other than fighting the monarchy they had already overthrown. Nearly every prominent revolutionary figure eventually went to the guillotine, executed by former allies who accused them of betrayal. The cycle of purges looked less like a people's movement and more like elite competition for dominance, with ideology becoming a tool for eliminating rivals. When Robespierre himself was arrested and executed in 1794, the crowd celebrated again. But this moment reveals something deeper. The revolution was not moving according to the will of the masses. It was swinging from one elite faction to another. With Robespierre gone, a new group of leaders, many of them wealthy bourgeois figures, took control during the Thermidorian reaction. They loosened some of the radical measures, ended the terror, and restored a degree of social normalcy. But they also restricted political clubs, disbanded popular societies, and pushed the working-class sans-culottes out of political life. The same revolution that had begun with cries of equality now saw elites reinforcing their authority. The Directory, which governed from 1795 to 1799, is perhaps the clearest example of how far the revolution had drifted from its original ideals. Elections existed, but they were manipulated. Corruption ran rampant. Inflation devastated the poor. And while France fought foreign wars, political leaders enriched themselves through military contracts and financial schemes. Many historians call this period a bourgeois dictatorship because although it was more moderate than the Terror, it was still firmly controlled by educated elites who distrusted both the monarchy and the common people. At this stage, it becomes difficult to argue that the revolution remained a pure uprising of ordinary citizens. The masses had provided the energy, the numbers, and the determination. But the direction of the revolution, the policies, the institutions, the new constitution, was shaped overwhelmingly by educated elites who had stepped into the vacuum left by the collapsing monarchy. Even when the people rose again, such as in the bread riots of 1795 or the uprisings of the sans-culottes, their actions were quickly crushed by the very leaders who once claimed to fight for them. And yet, this doesn't mean the revolution was a fraud. The people's suffering was real. Their demands were genuine. Their courage reshaped France in ways that cannot be denied. But revolutions are rarely pure expressions of public desire. More often, they are storms of emotion and upheaval that create opportunities for ambitious individuals with education, networks, and political skill. And these individuals often step forward claiming to represent the people, even when their goals align more closely with their own vision of power and order. By the late 1790s, France was exhausted. Famine, inflation, war, and political violence had drained the country. The people no longer had the energy or resources to lead another wave of mass uprising. In this vacuum emerged a new figure, Napoleon Bonaparte. He offered stability, efficiency, and order, values that many French citizens desperately wanted after years of chaos. Napoleon is often described as the man who ended the revolution, but in many ways, he was also its product. He rose through the very military system the revolution had transformed, benefited from its merit-based promotions, and won the loyalty of soldiers who believed they were defending the ideals of 1789, even as those ideals were becoming increasingly undefined. Napoleon's rise reveals a striking pattern repeated throughout history. Revolutions that begin in the name of the people often end with the emergence of a single dominant leader who promises to restore balance. And like many who came before him, Napoleon understood power deeply. He did not seize France by force in a single moment. He built alliances, presented himself as a hero of the Republic, and used political instability to justify taking executive authority. By the time he crowned himself emperor in 1804, most French citizens welcomed the decision. After years of instability, the promise of order outweighed the fear of authoritarianism. It is here that the central question of our investigation becomes unavoidable. If the revolution began as a people's uprising, how did it end with an emperor? How did a movement that proclaimed the sovereignty of the people lead to a centralized military dictatorship? The simplest answer, and also the most unsettling, is that the revolution was shaped by elites at every stage, whether those elites were noblemen, lawyers, Jacobin leaders, or military generals. The specific group in power changed, but the structure of leadership remained heavily top-down. And yet, this does not mean that the people were merely pawns. Their suffering sparked the fire, their protests created momentum. Their sacrifices reshaped the nation. But the story reveals a dynamic we see again and again in history. The people ignite revolutions, but rarely control them. The force of a mass uprising is powerful, but the direction of that force is often taken over by individuals who understand organization, rhetoric, and political strategy. These individuals may claim to fight for equality, but they often reinterpret the movement in ways that match their own interests. Throughout the revolution, whenever ordinary citizens demanded economic relief, lower bread prices, fair wages, stable markets, the elites responded by shifting the conversation to abstract principles like virtue, reason, republicanism, and national security. When the people demanded food and jobs, leaders gave them symbols, laws, and speeches. When workers protested rising prices, the government accused them of being counter-revolutionary. When peasants resisted new taxes, they were labeled enemies of the nation. The language of the revolution was democratic, but its mechanisms were controlled by those with political literacy. Even the Declaration of the Rights of Man, often celebrated as a triumph of liberty, was written by elites who intentionally avoided direct rights for women, the poor, or the colonized. It spoke of universal men, but reality remained deeply hierarchical. The revolution abolished feudalism, but it did not create economic equality. It destroyed noble privilege but replaced it with political privilege controlled by educated men. In this sense, the revolution was both a people's uprising and an elite redirection. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand it, not as one or the other, but as both. The French Revolution was driven by genuine mass suffering and mass hope. It was also steered, shaped, and at times manipulated by elites who understood how to convert chaos into political power. The two forces worked together, collided, and clashed at different moments, creating a complex story that cannot be reduced to a simple narrative. The truth is that revolutions are never clean. They begin with hunger, fear, and anger. They grow with ideas, speeches, and political dreams. They turn when ambitious individuals seize opportunities. And they end when a new structure of power stabilizes. Even if that new structure looks very different from the ideals that started the movement. In the end, the French Revolution succeeded in transforming France. It ended absolute monarchy, spread the idea of citizenship, and inspired future revolutions worldwide. But it also replaced one elite with another, unleashed waves of violence, and ultimately produced an emperor. Was it the people's uprising? Yes. Was it elite manipulation? Also yes. And that duality, that tension between genuine public revolt and elite-driven direction, is what makes the French Revolution one of the most fascinating, misunderstood, and endlessly debated events in history. Because when a revolution claims to speak for everyone, the real question is always, who is actually holding the pen?